Welcome to Dungeon Academics. My name is Thomas and I will be your instructor. In this video, I'd like to talk about the design choices behind damage and armour in role-playing games. And this is quite a mechanical discussion. It's something that I really enjoy thinking about. And it has a really, really important game design philosophy underpinning. And it's something I've talked about briefly in other videos as well, but it's worth me discussing again now. And this is the difference between simulation and game. Roleplay games are games. They're meant to be fun. They're played. But they have elements in them that are familiar to us in real life, or at least second-hand familiar to most of us. I'm talking about combat. There are plenty of people who play roleplay games who have served in the armed forces or who have been willingly or unwillingly involved in violent confrontation, and they have experienced actual combat. And I'm sure that they will tell you that combat in Dungeons & Dragons is nothing like combat in real life. And that's fine. Most of us will have consumed media that has some form of combat in it. TV shows, films, comic books, novels often have battles and fight scenes in them. And even if we haven't experienced combat in real life, we have this expectation of what combat is like. And some roleplay games do a better job of bringing that to life compared to other roleplay games and tabletop games and board games as well. So how realistic do we want our combat to be? Let's look at chess. Chess is one of the most popular board games in the world. It's been around for centuries, possibly millennia. I'd have to check that. It's been around for a long time. And its depiction of combat is highly unrealistic. This is not a simulation. This is a pure abstraction of combat. Yet, as a game, it's popular. It's easy to understand. I have played roleplay games that tried to treat combat more like a simulation. They go into the absolute detailed minutiae of what's going on. You will have modifiers for everything. When you fire a gun, you are keeping track of every bullet and where it goes, and it's quite complicated. Whether this makes an actual useful combat simulator, probably not, but it feels very detailed and simulation-like, and as a result, I think it's less of an abstraction, more of a simulation. Most roleplay games lie somewhere in the middle. Dungeons & Dragons is definitely more of an abstraction when it comes to combat. Everyone stands motionless while one character takes a 6-second turn, and then the next character will take their turn afterwards, but also occupying the same 6-second period of time. So if you have 10 characters, each taking 6 seconds, a minute hasn't passed because they're all experiencing the same 6 seconds, but not simultaneously. For the sake of gameplay, it's fine. This isn't a combat simulator, this is a game. And there needs to be a level of abstractions in the rules to make the game work. But, and here's the important thing, for a role-playing game, the combat has to feel real. There's this word in storytelling and filmmaking, verisimilitude, which is the feeling of authenticity to the world itself. So does the combat feel real with the respect to the world itself? If a giant swings its club at you, does it do more damage than a goblin shooting you with a short bow? Well, yes, it does, because that's what you would expect it to. Players have expectations of how game mechanics should work. And when these game mechanics don't line up with player expectations, then there is a disconnect between the player and the game that can take us out of not only our immersion, but our sense of fun. And this disconnect is quite important, because it's not a disconnect between the game and reality. It's a disconnect between the game and what the players expect reality to be. So, like I said, most players don't have any actual combat experience. So they're not comparing the combat in a game with real combat. They're comparing combat in the game with what they've seen in films and TV shows and what they imagine it to be like. And some games manage this a lot better than others. And all games will need to make compromises to make the game playable, to make the game fun. But this trinity of expectations, game mechanics being easy, and the game being fun, if you can get that balance right, then you're onto a winner. So how do games deal with that with respect to damage? The truth is that humans are, in many ways, very sturdy creatures. If you watch a heavyweight boxing match, you will see two athletes in absolutely amazing physical condition repeatedly punching each other in the body and head and not getting knocked unconscious. Alternatively, you could watch someone get hit in the head once and be unconscious, sometimes, unfortunately, forever. So sometimes we take a lot of damage to knock down, sometimes we can be taken down in one hit. There are lots of roleplay games that represent this frailty very realistically. If you've ever played Pendragon or Call of Cthulhu, both by Chaosium, you will know how squishy your character can be. And that when it comes to unarmed fights, you can take a lot of punches before you die. But if you lose enough hit points, you could be looking at weeks to recover. On the other hand, armed combat in both of those games, if you go into a fight against a skilled opponent who's carrying a sword or an axe and you are unarmored, your character has a real chance of death very quickly. And in Call of Cthulhu, being shot or hit by a larger monster, you have a very real chance of death in the first shot. Combat here is especially brutal and bloody, and I think that's what people expect it to be. In those games, if you get hit by a sword and you're not wearing armor, you kind of expect someone either to be maimed for life or killed. If you play in Call of Cthulhu, if your key investigator gets shot, there's a very good chance they're going to die or be horrifically wounded and taken out of action for a very long time. And that's what you expect in the context of that game. On the other hand, in Dungeons and Dragons, if you have a high-level character with a large hit pool, they can be taking multiple crossbow bolts all day long, and tomorrow morning they'll be fine. And because you're playing because you're playing what you expect to be a game of heroic action, this feels right. I've talked about this before, but the writers of Dungeons and Dragons want us to treat it like a game of resource attrition, but most players seem to want to play it as a game of heroic action, and Dungeons and Dragons kind of does a bit of both in this nailed together mishmash that just about works. But you've got a situation where your character is being shot multiple times with a crossbow and you're still charging into combat and fighting. I've had personal problems with this before when I've been running a game in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which suffers some of the same problems. And I've had a group of guards surround a group of player characters and say, look, you're coming with us, you need to speak to the governor. They've all got crossbows pointed at the characters. And the characters have looked at each other and they've said, you know what, we can take this damage. We can tank this damage and do whatever we want. So the threat of physical violence as a form of coercion just didn't work. Now, for narrative storytelling purposes, I was kind of wanting these people to go and speak to the governor, and the guards were being brusque about it. But the players thought, game mechanics wise, I can tank the damage and it's not a problem. Now, if they were slightly more experienced role players, this was a group of younger people, they'd understand that as a story point, if you're surrounded with crossbows being pointed at you, the story kind of expects you to do one thing. And they would have played along with that because of this expectation of verisimilitude, that when you're cornered and you've got weapons drawn on you, even if you know mathematically you're going to survive, narratively you don't want to be shot with a bunch of crossbow bolts, and it's probably a good idea to do what they say. So how to deal with that? Well, when you make a game, how to deal with damage is a really important decision to make. Dungeons and Dragons has just given you a pool of hit points, and when that pool of hit points is exhausted, you fall unconscious and are at risk of dying. Other roleplay games allow you to take serious damage without dying. So that first attack, even though it might not kill you, still has a risk of serious injury. Battlelords of the 23rd Century, a game I've played a lot in various different editions. If you took more than a quarter of your hit points in a single attack, you were at risk of serious injury. Now, this is played in a futuristic science fiction universe, so having your arm lopped off by an attack isn't so bad as long as you can get back to base and you can get a robotic one or a vat-grown one to replace it. It's not that bad. But in the moment, it would seriously limit your combat potential. So the risk of taking serious damage is there right from the start. You don't have to go, okay, as long as I've got more than 25% of my hit points left, I'm functionally invulnerable, I can do reckless things. That chance of taking critical damage exists right from the very first attack, and that changes the way that you play the game. I like that. Though you have to balance this with how heroic fantasy you want to be. In heroic fantasy games, having the character be almost unstoppable until they run out of hit points, they suffer no ill effect until they've drained all their hit points, is appealing. Now, I would like to have a system where you are slowed down somewhat by taking damage, but having a decent mechanic to do this is quite challenging. I think the X-Wing model game handled this quite well. Each of your ships has a few hull points. 3 or 4 is quite common for most ships. And when you run out of hull points, you're destroyed. But if lucky damage gets through your shields, it can damage a subsystem and slow you down a little bit. So the idea of a critical hit not doing more damage, but doing damage and is quite appealing to me. If a critical hit does enough damage through your armor, then it can do an additional negative effect to you, possibly temporary. Then there's always the chance that first hit can take you down or slow you down enough to make the fight something you no longer want to do. And that encourages players to be a little bit less reckless. So is that something that I'd want to implement for D&D? Probably not. Maybe. We'd have to think a lot about how to balance it between different characters. If your mage characters, your sorcerers and wizards can be knocked out on the first hit, I know they don't have as big a hit pool, but we still don't want them going down in the first round. How could we balance that out and make it fair? The next thing to think about mechanically is what armor does. Now, we all have this intuitive understanding that characters wearing armor are harder to kill. They can take more damage, more hits, more punishment before they succumb to their injuries. And roleplay games have a lot of different ways of handling how armor works. Dungeons and Dragons is perhaps one of my least favorite mechanically. The idea that the more armor you have, the harder you are to hit, or the harder it is to get a good hit on you. but if the hit lands, it still does full damage. That is slightly immersion breaking for me. It doesn't feel right. It breaks my sense of verisimilitude. I hope I'm pronouncing that way. It's a word I've only ever seen written down. So I don't necessarily like the way it works, except for the fact that it's mechanically very simple. That you have characters that are good at dodging, so they have a high armor class, and you have characters that are wearing lots of thick metal, so they have a high armor class. And mechanically, the chance of dodging out of the way of an attack or deflecting it off your armor is handled exactly the same way. Not a huge fan of that for other games, but for D&D, perhaps this is the best system that we've got. Most other roleplay games handle armor as a way of absorbing damage. So some roleplay games, most roleplay games, have a sort of soak system, that the amount of armor that you have is a damage reduction on anything that hits you. So Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, for example, whenever you took damage, you would subtract your toughness value plus however many points of armor you have on that location. In Pendragon, you subtract your armor and shield value away from the damage of any hit. You subtract the shield value if your defense was high enough to get it in the way. I quite like how Pendragon does that in the current 6th edition. In the Star Wars roleplay game, each point of armor reduced the damage by 1. So it is possible that an attack hits you and you have enough armor that you completely ignore it. And this feels right to me mechanically, that there is a chance that the shot misses and you take no damage. And if you're wearing enough armor, there's a chance that you can be lucky and it doesn't get through your armor. I quite like that, but it's a multi-step system. In Dungeons and Dragons, it's all handled in the hit roll and then damage just goes through. Now we have a hit roll and a damage reduction, so there's a second mechanical step. The MCDM roleplay game, Draw Steel, I think it's called now, handles armor in quite an interesting way. It gives you extra hit points. And the argument they make there is that mathematically, having a damage reduction reduce the potency of each attack is quite similar to just having more hit points. Whereas there is definitely something very satisfying about saying, okay, that attack, my armor tanks it and I don't take any damage even though it hits. Having a proportionally larger pool of hit points, just saying my armor absorbs it and I'm still fine, it feels the same way mathematically. So I think that was a good decision. It also saves a step mathematically. Again, does the attack hit? Yes or no. If it does hit, you take this much damage and you just take it off your armor pool. And because you got more armor, you have a larger damage pool. It works really nicely. There is another way to handle armor, and I haven't seen this as much in roleplay games, but it's very common in tabletop games, and that's an armor save. Is your armor tough enough to deflect the attack? So in Warhammer 40,000, you work out if the attack hits, you work out if the attack damages the target, and then the target gets an armor save. The thing I really like about armor saves is that it represents how good some attacks are at getting through armor. That you can have some weapon systems or some types of attack that are better at getting through armor than others. So armor-piercing rounds, laser weaponry, certain melter weaponry is really good at getting through armor, so the armor will provide less protection. And as part of a more, I don't want to say, well, I've used the word simulation, as part of a more detailed approach to dealing with armor, having different armor react in different ways to different types of attacks is very satisfying. It adds another level of strategy to think about. One thing I've said in other videos is I like the idea that a character would want to change weapons depending on the circumstances they're in. they'll go, okay, against this target, I want to pick this weapon for these reasons. But once that target is killed, I might actually consider changing weapon to go for the next target, because for different reasons, this other weapon would be better. So if you're in a situation where you've got, let's think, for example, a bear and a heavily armored knight. Bears don't wear much armor, so taking a weapon that is very good at poking small holes in metal isn't going to be very effective against a bear. You want to use a chainsaw against a bear and really carve that thing up. But a chainsaw against a knight in heavy armor, the teeth of the chainsaw are just going to skid off the plate armor. So you want something like a war pick or a mace, which would still hurt the bear, but definitely not be as effective as a chainsaw. So having different types of attack react in different ways against armor. Armor saves are really good for that, but they're not the only thing they're really good for. They're not the only system that handles the different damage types really, really well. Some armor systems and armor mechanics can definitely be perhaps a little too complicated. The previous editions of Battlelords of the 23rd century had a system that I loved playing, but it was too intensive for most roleplay games. You had a system where each piece of armor, each location on your body had 3 different values. There was threshold, which just was a damage reduction. Then there was absorption, which was how much damage that location could absorb before the rest got passed through to you. And there with structure, I'm probably getting the words wrong here, which is how much damage that piece of armor could take before it fell off you. And different weapon systems interacted with those 3 different values in different ways. So you had some weapons that were really good at poking through the threshold value, but weren't so good at getting through absorption. And then you had some weapon systems which are okay at getting through the threshold and absorption, but really chewed through the structure, rendering the armor less useful later on. And so when you were picking armor, it wasn't just a case of going which are the highest values. It was looking at a balance between them and going, okay, this armor's great, but it's going to fall to pieces really quickly if the opponents are using this kind of weaponry. So there was this big, I don't want to say metagame, there was this big element of structure and planning, trying to work out which weapon and armor systems was going to be best. And in the context of that game, it worked very well. But in the context of a game of heroic fantasy, perhaps not. But I do really like the idea that different attacks can be better against some types of armor or some types of resistances than other. So is there a way to fix this in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition or 5.5? Probably not. Is there a way to implement it in a future edition of Dungeons & Dragons? I don't think so, without fundamentally changing the nature of what the game is. I don't think we want to do that. But if you're making your own roleplay game, then this is definitely something that you consider. How do you want to handle armor? Is it going to be a straight damage reduction? Is it going to be a chance of an attack missing, either by factoring it into the hit roll or a separate save? Or is it just going to be a pool of hit points that the attack has to get through? And do different attack types treat armor the same way? Now, I've loved roleplay game equipment books for a long, long time. A friend of mine was big into cyberpunk in the late 90s, and he had the Chrome books, which were full of cybernetic augmentation and different weapon and armor systems, pages and pages of stats. I love that. I've got armament books for different roleplay games here with pages of weapons and pages of stats and different modifiers for different armor types. And I love looking through that. But older me realizes that that's not really great for making a roleplay game that's fluid and fun and adventurous to play in. But having weapons that are differentiated more than just on base damage, this weapon is good because it hits you and knocks you over, but this weapon is good because it hits you and it's really good at poking holes through armor if you're wearing thick armor. This idea of damage and differentiating weapons is very appealing to me. So differentiating weapons, not just on the additional effects they can do, but also how they interact with your armor, I think's fun. Good for D&D? Probably not. Good for other games? Definitely. Now, I'd really like to know what roleplay games have implemented the relationship between damage and damage type and armor really, really well. I have played a lot of roleplay games, but there are even more that I've never touched and so many more that I've never even heard of. And that's always one of the fun things I look for in game mechanics, just the nitty-gritty of how damage and armor works. So when I get a roleplay game, I'll normally look at character creation, the skills and funky abilities that characters get, and then the mechanical side of the interaction between damage and armor. So if there are any great roleplay games that you think handle this really, really well, I want to read about them. So tell me, please, which games handle the interaction between damage, damage type, and armor, and I will look into them and use that to increase my own knowledge, which is one of the reasons I'm making these videos. It's not just a quest for me to get as many people to listen to my voice as possible. It's a quest for me to be able to find out things that I don't know, and I enjoy doing that. So please, in the comments, let me know which games handle it really well, and if I haven't played them or don't have experience with them, I'll look them up and figure out if there's anything that I can learn, because there probably is. So thank you, and enjoy your next game, whatever it may be.